Hello again, and welcome to the Daily Bread Bible Study, where we are studying in the book of Judges, chapters 17 through 19, for day 78, Wednesday, March 18th, 2020, here in the story of Judges, continuing on with some unsavory characters who can make some poor choices, and there's a lot going on in this text, and this section in particular than I particularly know, nor do I want to know. We get into some really terrible things later on, especially in Judges chapter 19. I will talk a little bit more about that later. But at this moment in time, we see in Judges 17 that things are a little bit lawless. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. So without leaders, people fall into dysfunction. Here we see the story of a Levite connected with the tribe of Dan. And through doing what was quote unquote right in their own eyes, we witness the turning away from God. This turning away leads to a couple things: worship of idols, rash acting priests, and stealing, even sexual immorality. And so at Judges 17, it begins after the story of Samson, where Delilah traded him in for 1,100 pieces of silver. In doing what he deems right, an Ephraimite man, here name who's mentioned as Micah, returns 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother. So the 1,100 and the 1,100 here in two separate stories, seemingly connecting the two. It feels like it is hardly a coincidence that these two numbers and pieces of silver are used to, in these stories back to back in chapters. Now the coins seem good for good use at first. Micah, whose name means one who is like the Lord, returns the silver to his mother, and this seems to be a good thing. His mother asks for the Lord's blessing upon her son. Then the mother has an idol cast from the silver coins, which seems less good. It seems like idolatry. And so the silver becomes a house figurine, a teraphim as it's called, and Micah then makes an ephod, which is a vestment of the high priest there in the tabernacle of the Lord, and installs one of his sons as priest. This has idolatry written all over it, but it's possible that this could also be a form of reverence, noting that there's general positivity in this story. There doesn't seem to be rebuke of him for doing this. This also leads to the Levites being priests in the tribe of Dan. And so either this is, a dig on all of that practices, or there's possibly some redeeming value against idolatry here that I'm not aware of. But either way, it is a rather confusing story for us. Anyways, I should also note, too, that this character, Micah, is different than the later prophet, Micah, who will, say things like, he says, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with the Lord your God? That's a different character. He has his own book of the Bible, but this is a sub-story of another biblical character named Micah. Anyways, a Levite, most likely a descendant of Moses, as it says in Judges 18:30, comes up from Bethlehem in the tribe of Judah, and Micah hires him to be a priest residing at his home, offers to pay him some of the silver he gave to his mother, and the Levite accepts. Micah feels very blessed at this point. And then in Judges 18, we see Micah's celebration ends when members of the tribe of Dan send some scouts, and the scouts come by his path on his home. Now, on their way up north to scout out Laish and Sidon, they travel past the residence of Micah. And these 5 Danite scouts, after quote unquote recognizing his voice, speak to the Levite and inquire successfully of the Lord. So the scouts meet the rest of the troops and bring them up, and once again they pass by where the Levite is living. This time, with a force of 600 men, they impress upon the Levite to come with them, who accepts the offer. I don't know if he has much choice. Judges 18:20 says, "Then the priest accepted the offer, and he took the ephod, the teraphim, and the idol, and went along with the people." Thus, Micah's house shrine is gone. And instead of fighting them, what's one man going to do against this strong force? He goes back home. Micah's idol then becomes a fixture in the city of the Danites, the one that they conquer Laish, which gets renamed to the city of Dan. A very fitting name for the tribe of Dan. Now in Judges 19, the story continues and it gets even more weird. In chapter 18, the Danites got blessed by a Levite, and in chapter 19, the Benjaminites get cursed by a Levite. And while this story may be used to justify why the Benjaminite clan decreased in size, this level of disregard for women and their bodies is shameful even for a society which considered women as property. If you've been harmed physically and could experience any sort of trauma from this story, please just play it safe and turn off this video now. Now, assuming that you have not been traumatized, we hear the story about presumably a different Levite, and the story tells us of a Levite taking a concubine. The concubine does not love him and runs away from home back to her father's house. And in their society, it should also be noted that the concubine had no rights to run away, for the exchange was legal and binding between the men, between the Levite and the father. So the father invites his son-in-law and daughter to stay an extra few days. It sounds like there's a lot of merrymaking, enjoyment, but eventually the Levite grows tired of being with his father-in-law and lingering, and the Levite finally leaves with the concubine. After pressing hard in travel, the sun goes down while they are near Gibeah, and they enter into the city. They're in that region of the Benjaminites. They enter into the city, and no one will provide these outsiders with lodging for the night. It actually takes another outsider, an old Ephraimite man, to give them a place to stay. In what only could be called an utterly shameful series of events, the men of the town knock on the door asking to gang rape the Levite. And instead, the homeowner says no, offers his virgin daughter, and then offers his concubine. So ultimately, a concubine, which I presume is the Levites, it's uncertain though, the concubine is thrown out to satiate the violent mob. And they have their way with her, likely killing her in the process. In outrage, the Levite then cuts the concubine into 12 pieces and sends a piece to each of the tribes, saying, "Thus you shall say to all the Israelites, has such a thing ever happened since the day that the Israelites came up from the land of Egypt and to this day? Consider it, take counsel, and speak out." Well, the idea is that such a thing never has happened, that it is an increasingly even more destructive way for the Benjaminites to act, just showing the utter inhumanity and the lack of regard for sanctity of life there for the Benjaminites, not to mention violating all sorts of laws that the book of Moses talks about. But on a note for our day and time, I'm going to take his advice too. And I will consult and take counsel and speak out. So I have 4 things that I feel called to say because of this. One is that rape is never okay. It's not. The second is, along with that, is being respectful of people's bodies and not practicing abuse of that. Is that women are more than just the property of men. That unfortunately, like the idea that men are the head of the household often gets, perpetuates this idea that men are somehow either more valuable than women, or that men can treat women as property, and that's not the case. The third is spouses should protect one another instead of throwing each other to the wolves, so that, I should say in this story, this man's decision, the Levite's decision, the old man's decision, they were wrong to throw out this concubine. And then even fourth, as well as with that, if the woman is alive, mutilating her body is just utterly reprehensible. If she is dead, mutilating her body is shows no respect for the sanctity of her life, and no respect for this woman's body, and she becomes objectified in one way, shape, or form, whether having been living or currently dead, and is now just a point to be made to the other 12 to the 12 tribe leaders. So just this is a very dysfunctional text. I wish it was not in the Bible, but at the same time, we're called to wrestle with these texts and to learn from them. And I hope that you are as afraid and just taken aback by this story as I am. And may you learn from it and to realize that both this is what we consider our sacred scripture, and that also that sacred scripture can speak of terrible and horrible things, and we don't have to repeat them. So anyways, I hope this whole story of these stories of dysfunction and these strange texts help you to realize that the Bible is in a lot of ways a very complicated story, and getting down to the root of it takes a lot of heart, it takes a lot of empathy, and it should call us to act in ways that can be different than how they acted in the past. So I hope you learned from that. I wish God's blessings, and thanks for joining me for this hard Bible study today.